First Monday concerts get planned many months in advance. We never know quite what is going to happen in the meantime. What we do know as we are approaching the end of the season is that life is still in pretty bad shape. We've got the virus all over the place. We've got a war between Ukraine and Russia and an invasion by Russia into the Ukraine. And interestingly enough, the program that we have for this concert coming up hasn't changed. But there have been reasons along the way that we were concerned whether it should change, and I'll get to that later. We have only two pieces on the program, and each of them is an absolute masterpiece. The first piece on the program by none other than our great friend Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was written because in his late life, in his Vienna days, which started around 1781, he happened to meet somebody that played the clarinet in a way that he had never imagined it could be played. That man's name was Anton Stadler, Stadler. And that had a profound impact on Mozart. They became pretty good friends. They were about the same age. Mozart was born, as we know, in 1756. Stadler was born in 1753, so he was 3 years older. And because Mozart died so young, Stadler outlived him by 20 years or so. What attracted Mozart to Stadler's playing was that it was so incredibly expressive and musical in a way that he didn't know that instrument could be handled. And that really set him up to want to write music for that. Composers are like that. They hear somebody who plays really well, that inspires them to write something for that player. This was exactly that. The first piece that Mozart wrote for him was a trio for piano, viola, and clarinet. In the first performance, you might be interested to know Mozart wasn't playing the piano, he was playing the viola. He loved the viola. Later on, when he had written all of his great quartets dedicated to Haydn, in the first performances of them, Haydn was the second violinist and Mozart was the violist. And the relationship blossomed over the next few years. Mozart was very deeply involved in the Masonic movement. Mozart was Catholic, and he was Catholic all of his life. But on a parallel track to that, it was the age of reason. And a lot of people of philosophical bent, particularly that I know about in Vienna, who were among Mozart's best friends, also became Masons. So the first area of music that they did together was music for the Masons, which was music that was written for the death of very prominent friends in the Masonic movement. Trauermusik, mourning, music of mourning. And it turned out that there was another instrument that Stadler and his brother were playing, and they were known as basset horns. And they were somewhere between a clarinet and a bassoon. And they were very mournful. So that seemed like an ideal musical instrument for Mozart to use for those pieces. As they became more friendly with one another, Mozart decided that he was going to write a piece for Stadler for clarinet and string quartet, the Clarinet Quintet. And that's the piece that we're going to hear in this concert. This is considered one of the greatest pieces of chamber music ever written. It is sublimely beautiful, and it has a typical four-movement set with one as a set of variations, and it's just unbelievably beautiful. I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about music that's so good because the words are so inadequate to describe it, and it's just best to let you listen to it. But I will say a little bit more about the relationship between them. Um, the piece is not written quite for clarinet or quite for basset horn. It was written for an instrument that had mostly like a clarinet with some notes added a little bit lower, and it was called the basset clarinet, so that would not be confused with the bass clarinet, which is a completely different instrument with much lower sounds. And so the quintet was written for basset clarinet, and that means on a modern clarinet there are a few notes that have to be transcribed upwards, which is mostly what happens. But there are people who play extending the range of it. I remember one performance I was involved in somewhere, the clarinetist rolled up some music and put it at the end of the clarinet so that it had lower notes. Kind of interesting. But let's just leave it at that and say that's an interesting curiosity. The only thing I want to tell you is a little bit more about the relationship was that I think it was Mozart's last trip to Prague. Prague was a place where Mozart had huge success, and that was the first performance of Don Giovanni, which came in that same period, and also another work called the Clemenza di Tito, the Clemency of Titus. And actually, he brought Stadler there to Prague and wrote another aria in the opera so that Stadler could be part of the orchestra. That's, if you're Mozart, that's not hard to do. And if you're Mozart's friend, and he wants you, you go. Things didn't end 100% perfectly, though, I will say, that almost the last piece Mozart wrote was a clarinet concerto for Stadler. It has the number Köchel 622, and that's just about at the end. And it was actually commissioned by Stadler. He was going to pay Mozart for the quintet. And that is a work also in the same key, A major, that is sunshiny and magnificent and profound. And it's hard to say it, but not long after he wrote that, Mozart died. And he died at the end of 1791. So there was this incredible year in which so many things happened, ending sadly. And things went bad between Stadler and Mozart's widow because he never paid for the piece and later on used Mozart's reputation mostly to enhance his own. Nonetheless, we have to say that it was his magical playing that enables us to have this great piece, which we're going to hear now. The last piece on our last first Monday of this season is a very important piece for NEC and for me. And I'm going to get a lot into that because it's a wonderful story to tell. Les Noces, or The Wedding, was the piece that was the last piece that was heard in Jordan Hall the night before everything stopped in Jordan Hall in 1995 as we restored the hall to its current splendor. And the last sounds we heard in the hall before the next morning workmen came in to remove all of the chairs and put up scaffolding over a period of time were the very end chords of Les Noces, which is to sound like the church bells at the end of a wedding ceremony. And the sounds are made by the combination of pianos, there are 4 of them, and chimes. And there was something so magical about that sound that the entire summer that we were doing the restoration of Jordan Hall, and I was president of the school then, whenever I walked into the hall, which was full of dust and workmen and hammering and noise and this and that, every time I walked into the hall, I heard those chimes ringing. It sustained me during a very exhilarating and scary time. Was it going to turn out well? And we know it did. So anyway, that's one stage of the importance of this piece for this institution in Jordan Hall. But I want to go back now and put it in its historical context and tell you a little bit about how it happened. First of all, I will say as a preamble, there's been an awful lot of dialogue in the last 2 months since a war began by the Russian invasion of Ukraine about how do we respond to that at the cultural level. It could be everything from everything Russian is bad, we can't do anything Russian. I got around that for the April concert by presenting music by somebody we think of as a Russian composer, Sergei Prokofiev, who was actually Ukrainian. And that was an interesting chance to celebrate that and Ukrainian musicians. Now we're in the position of dealing with a piece that is amazingly Russian in its spirit and character. But what's also interesting is that all of those Russian pieces that we think of from Igor Stravinsky were not written in Russia. He by then had left Russia, and he was living from around 1910 in either Switzerland or France. He actually became a citizen of France in 1925. And he never went back to Russia except for one very quick trip as the Russian Revolution was beginning to gather belongings from his home. And so, in a way, if you follow the history of Igor Stravinsky, Russian born, to be sure. Soviet, never. French, by citizenship. And then in 1945, American by citizenship, where, with the exception of a few trips, he lived for the rest of his life, and where he died in 1971. So, do you say you should not do Russian music written by somebody who was international in the best sense, even though the spirit of the piece is Russian? My personal stance on that is that culture is influenced by place, but transcends it. And in this piece, and I'll come back more in detail to it in a minute, we're celebrating something that is universal in mankind, the wedding, the preparing and leading to the next continuity of the next generation. And so, but let's stop for a second and look what had happened to Stravinsky. Stravinsky had met an entrepreneurial impresario named Sergei Diaghilev. And they met in St. Petersburg. And Diaghilev was a great creator of ballet. He was passionate about ballet. He was not an actual artist himself. He was a promoter of the arts. And he had created something with a French title, Ballet Russe, the Russian ballet, for performances in Paris. And the first magical product of that relationship was none other than a piece that everybody knows now, The Firebird. And it was played there in 1910. So by that time, pretty much Stravinsky was out of Russia, but he was full of Russia. Because a year later, pushed by Diaghilev, he wrote another masterpiece that everybody knows called Petrushka. It's about a puppet that falls in love with another puppet. And it's a very, very great piece. And all of a sudden, Stravinsky, who was taught instrumentation by Rimsky-Korsakov in St. Petersburg, as it was called then, was on his way. And then what settled him into being one of the very short list of very great composers of the 20th century happened in 1913, when he took Russian heritage about early days, including sacrifices of a girl to the gods to bring spring back. And it's called, of course, the Rite of Spring. And the Rite of Spring was just absolutely, it tore everybody's ears apart about what is music. Because Stravinsky was doing things there that hadn't been done before, and he was revolutionary in the very real sense of culturally revolutionary, not politically. So from that point on, Stravinsky was very interested in the culture of his country, but wasn't living there anymore and didn't want to. And already in 1913, shortly after the premiere of The Rite of Spring, he began to sketch out a piece that he called Les Noces, the wedding. And this was based upon his own libretto, which is about the various pictures, tableaux he called them, of what leads up to the wedding. So first of all, there is the first scene in the house of the bride. And the second scene is in the house of the groom. And they're kept apart, as is tradition in marriages. And then the third tableau, as it's called, was the wedding itself. And the fourth one is the feast after the wedding. So this is about as unpolitical a piece as you can get. And the sound of it is so wonderful. And around the time that he had drafted it, even though he'd not finished it yet, in this period, in the middle of I would say probably about 1914 or 15, he played it, I guess, on the piano for Diaghilev. And this is a quotation from Stravinsky himself. It's wonderful. He said, "When I first played it for Sergei Diaghilev, he wept and said it was the most beautiful and purely Russian creation of our ballet. I think he did love Les Noces more than any other work of mine. That is why I dedicated it to him." There is something about this piece that is pure magic. There is something about it that is absolutely universal. And I can't find myself of punishing all of us or Stravinsky's reputation for not playing it just because it has that background, because it has to do with universal qualities. So let me tell you a little bit more about how it came to be and what happened afterwards. By 1917, he had made a first draft of it, and he decided he was going to use the same orchestra that he used for The Rite of Spring, which in its earliest form was a pit orchestra because it was ballet. It was not the huge orchestra that we're used to hearing it at now when Stravinsky revised it for that purpose. But he was dissatisfied with that. And then he had a contract with the Pleyel Piano Company, which was making pianos for him with piano rolls. You know, I don't know whether any of you remember that. When I was a little kid, I think we even owned a piano where you could put it in and turn it on, and the keys would go down according to the punches that were made in the piano roll. So he had conceived of it then for a pianola, which was what it was called, two cymbalums, which were Hungarian instruments that are played with hammers, like a hammered dulcimer, and percussion. And then he was having all kinds of trouble with the Pleyel company, and so he put that aside. And finally, he finished it between the years of 1921 and 23, sometimes in Switzerland, where he was living part of the time, sometimes in France, where he was living part of the time. And its first performance was in 1923 in Paris as a ballet. So there it was, and it was increasingly admired, maybe not quite with the same fervor as the early, very exciting pieces like the Firebird. Well, what happened was that as World War II was approaching in 1939, he moved to Los Angeles. A lot of people who were emigres from Europe moved to the West Coast, and there were reasons for that, a lot of musicians. One was the weather. A second one was it seemed very far away from all of the problems in Europe. Before the time of all of the electronic media, it was, because you didn't know what was happening there until days later, or usually, or whatever. Telegraph would bring news, but it was seemingly safe. The other thing was that Los Angeles, which is where I was born, became a haven for Western and Eastern European musicians, because the movie industry came along, and after 1928, it had sound. And so when I was a kid, and most early memories of mine are in the 1940s, Los Angeles had 7 symphony orchestras. Only one of them was the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The others were 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, all of the movie studios, Columbia, they all had their own symphony orchestras. And it's into that area of activity that Los Angeles became really an extremely important cultural center, and where Stravinsky moved. And it's actually the truth that Stravinsky lived in Los Angeles till near the end of his life when he moved to New York. It was the place that he lived longer than any other place that he had lived in his life. Los Angeles was home. And he became a U.S. citizen in 1945, just after the end of the Second World War. So I have a couple of personal experiences that I want to share with you. I was involved in a series called the Monday Evening Concerts. That sounds a little bit like First Monday, and it's intentional. And I was a very active young professional from 1963 to 70 in Los Angeles. And during that time, I was a very frequent guest performer on the Monday Evening Concerts. So the first one that I want to mention to you, because there are 2 of them, was not Les Noces. That came later. The first one was one of Stravinsky's last pieces. It was called Requiem Canticles. It was October 31st of 1966 in Los Angeles. And I can tell you that I was the first cellist of a very small group in that first performance in Los Angeles of Requiem Canticles. And I can tell you that Igor Stravinsky was sitting in the front row about 4 or 5 feet away from where I was sitting. If you want to talk about things that are memorable in somebody's life, that was one of them. The last one, though, just to tie all of this together, was that in 1968, the 86-year-old Igor Stravinsky and his family came to a very special concert in which I also was playing, because it included the first version of Les Noces, which was for kind of a rite of spring orchestra in small version, and in which I was playing, and the second version including the cymbalums and the player pianos and the percussion, and the vocal soloists, of course, and then finally the third version. And again, I was playing on the stage, and there was Stravinsky in the audience, and it was such a big occasion for a very small auditorium that the program was repeated. It was done at 7:30 and 9 o'clock. It was not a terribly long program. It included 2 new transcriptions of Hugo Wolf songs that Stravinsky had made that were getting their world premiere. It included 2 versions of Symphonies of Winds that Stravinsky had done earlier, and it ended with the complete Les Noces. And I was so moved by that when we were approaching the restoration of Jordan Hall, it had to be done. And I can tell you along the way, it was written in Russian. It was sometimes done in French. And then in 1959, there was a recording by Igor Stravinsky in English, done with the 4 pianos. It's a big piece, 4 pianos, 7 percussion players, 4 vocal soloists and chorus. Jordan Hall stage is going to be quite full, I promise you. Anyway, the pianists in the 1959 recorded version done in English were none other than Samuel Barber, Aaron Copland, Lucas Foss, and Roger Sessions, 4 very important composers in America at that time. So we're going to hear it on this concert, and I want you to think as the bells ring at the very end of it, that they're ringing with a plea for peace. Please enjoy the concert.